So I need my coiling core, 3 to 4 arms lengths of yarn, plastic needle, and scissors. I start by cutting the end of the core to a taper. I take my yarn and lay it down along the coiling core. I pinch it in place with my non-dominant hand and use my dominant hand to start wrapping the yarn over the core toward the taper. This secures the beginning of the yarn inside of our wrapping. Then I keep wrapping toward the tapered end. I bend the tapered end into this teardrop shape with a small hole in it and wrap the end a little further. Now I pinch the tapered end into the teardrop shape, and now I wrap my yarn all the way around this curve and keep wrapping to secure the end. I can always adjust my wrapping as I go and keep it neat. And now I wrap all the way to the end of the taper. So now I have my teardrop shape, and I'm going to curve the core around it. There's no knots, no tying needed in coiling. Everything is held together by the tension. At this point, I want to make a stitch that will secure my coils together. So I'm going to thread the end of my yarn through the plastic needle. And I do not need a knot or anything, just thread it through and leave a short tail. Here I unwrapped a little to get my stitch in the exact spot I want it. I pinched the core into place and put my needle through the hole that I left in the teardrop shape. Pull the yarn all the way through and do a second stitch. Two stitches is good practice to keep everything in place. What also helps is pulling the stitches really tight. Now I keep wrapping, and right after a stitch I have to make sure that I get the yarn under the little crevice of core that's so tight against the coil above it. And now I just keep wrapping. Now I'm going to make another stitch, which you should do every 10 to 15 wraps. So 2 tight stitches into the coil above. As I'm wrapping, I test the curve of the coil to pick a good spot for a stitch. Now I'm away from the teardrop center, so my stitch is going to go into the coil above the one I'm working on. Again, 2 stitches into the coil above, and just repeat the wrapping and the stitches. I'm getting to the end of my yellow yarn, so I'm going to add in this blue yarn. I have to leave a tail of the yellow yarn, which I actually made too short, so here I'm unwrapping a bit. I do this a lot, it's a part of the process. So I lay my blue yarn along the coil in the direction I'm wrapping, like we did at the beginning. We're going to secure the beginning of the blue yarn underneath the wrapping. When I have just a short tail of yellow yarn left, I'm going to lay it along the core and then pick up the blue yarn and continue wrapping with it. So here, when I started with my new yarn, I actually started wrapping in a different direction than before. I could have avoided this, but it's no problem. It just means I have to change the position I insert the needle from. Coiling is a forgiving process, so just go with the flow of the material. To make a more gradual yarn change, I leave an even longer tail of my blue yarn, lay down my new yellow yarn, do a couple wraps with the blue, then switch, lay the blue along the core and use the yellow to wrap over it. I can keep switching between the two. This gives a different effect to the transition between yarns. Similarly, I can work with two different yarns at the same time to get a stripe effect. I lay down my second yarn just as if I was going to change yarns, wrap over it with my blue yarn to secure it, and when I want to switch yarns, I just lay the blue along the core, pick up my white yarn, and start wrapping. So the blue yarn is running along the core inside of my wrapping. So at any point I can switch between my two yarns. This can be harder to maneuver because you have another long thread to keep track of, but it adds some nice variety to the work. However, remember to keep making regular stitches, otherwise your work will fall apart. You can also always trim a yarn that you're done working with. Here I'm getting to the end of my core. I want to give extra care to these last steps and make sure the end is well secured. I've cut the end of the core to a taper, and I actually could have cut more. To get a nice gradual finish, you should cut a long gradual taper. I'm going to do more stitches at the end here, one every couple wraps of yarn. These extra stitches will keep my end very secure. Now I wrap until the very end of the taper. This requires a lot of fine control, but you can always trim the taper if it's giving you a lot of trouble. A few stitches at the very end of the taper. On my very last stitch, I'm going to come back up in between the coils rather than around, so my yarn is tucked in between the tight coils. At this point, I switch to a metal tapestry needle, which is much thinner than the plastic one. I thread my yarn into the metal needle. Now I'm going to push the needle under the wrapping. As you can see, I wrapped very tightly, so it's taking some work to get the needle in. I just have to get it through half an inch or so of the wrapping, especially since I wrapped so tight. So now my needle is going under the wrapping, and I pull the yarn through. Now that the end of the yarn is secure under the wrapping, I can just trim it off. And here's my finished work.